No.
Okay.
Ok, potete partire.
Siamo già su YouTube?
Sì, sì.
Then I think we can start. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm very happy and honored to introduce Professor Yaroslav Hrytsak, one of the leading Ukrainian historians. And this talk will be a presentation, a discussion of his new book, which has been translated into Italian, A breve storia dell'Ucraina. And so we'll have here two very valuable scholars of Ukrainian history, Professor Simone Bellezza and Professor Simona Merlo, both specialists of Ukrainian history, which is, I think, represents the interest and the activity of the Italian historiography in this field. And of course, Professor Hrytsak, the author of the book. We hope to have a nice conversation about his book. And I think it's important, perhaps the only thing I should say is that the book is important not just in itself or the interest that there is about Ukrainian history, but also, I would say, as a necessity to change our views as historians and to look at a history which is often seen as a unity, also from different perspectives, from the history of the different parts of what used to be the Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. So it's a very, very welcome addition to our knowledge. We can start perhaps with Professor Simona Merlo. I would ask you your comments about the book, and then we'll proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Alberto Masoero and all the organizers of this presentation for invitation to discuss Yaroslav Hrytsak's book. I think that it is an important book with many merits. The first merit is to talk about the history of Ukraine, not from the perspective of a remote corner of Europe, but by placing Ukraine in the much wider horizon of global history. This is, I think, it's the first merit. It is a successful attempt to deprovincialize the history of Ukraine, to take it out of isolation, even historiographical isolation, and to offer it to a public of readers, not only of the specialists, but also the educated readers who want to understand this history. Unfortunately, I think the Italian translation of the title makes it difficult to understand the perspective in which the book is situated. The original title, in fact, is A Global History of Ukraine. And the key to global history is the one chosen by the author to give the readers the opportunity to better understand what is happening in today's Ukraine and to help them orient themselves. It is a book that, unlike previous works on Ukraine, such as the monographs by Paul Magocci and Sergei Plokhy, does not want to devote attention to facts, does not want to be a histoire événementielle, but instead seeks to offer a history of Ukraine under the dual key of global history and longue durée. Here, then, the field of research expands from the history of Ukraine to the connections underlying our globalized world, a network of connections within which the process of formation of modern Ukraine is also situated. The second merit of the book is its attempt to break out of the bottlenecks of a history that is limited only to the national movement. Its refusal to consider the nation as the main or even the only object of study, as the author says in the introduction. In this sense, it also overcomes what might be called the paradigm of rupture, that is, the evaluation of the Soviet period as a moment of rupture in the continuity of Ukrainian history. On the contrary, Yaroslav Hrytsak asserts that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was the embodiment of dreams that the Ukrainian movement has nurtured since the days of brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius, in the sense that the national organization founded in Kiev in 1845 had given an ideology to the Ukrainian question, moving it from the literally to the more properly political plane, and which had been repressed by the Tsarist power. The ambitious operation attempted by Hrytsak moves on a rather delicate ridge. Indeed, it is difficult to avoid the risk of essentialism in a narrative that reaches back to the Middle Ages, to that Kievan Rus, the inheritance of which we know is currently disputed between Russia and Ukraine, with each claiming to be the sole legitimate successor. Hrytsak rightly points out that, I quote, "This is a meaningless argument. Rus was neither Russian nor Ukrainian, since nation-states did not appear until almost 1,000 years later." This statement may seem superfluous to Italian readers, but not to the Ukrainian public, which was the first to receive a book that has since now been translated into several languages, including Italian. The terms Ukraine and Ukrainians originally had multiple meanings and only became firmly established in their present sense in the 19th century. Their use in early historical periods, as has been the case in other works, is a source of confusion and difficulty in understanding. For this reason, the third merit of the book is that it dares to venture into a rough terrain where it would be easy to slip. Finally, the fourth merit lies in the contribution this book makes to both public discussion and historical research. As the last part of introduction makes clear, the author does not have truths to dispense, but rather questions to ask. With some irony, Hrytsak states that if this book does not provoke more serious debates about Ukraine's past and present, that will be my worst punishment. I think there is no punishment for him. Digging deeper into history, not to judge, but to understand, to explore beneath the surface, according to the lesson of Mark Bloch, to whom the author refers, is the best antidote to simplifications and the flattening of history into a chronicle. In this sense, doing Ukrainian history also means, in my opinion, navigating the rough waters of the present with a compass that helps not to get lost. And now, having listed the merits, I would like to raise two brief questions that arose for me while reading the book, and that I would like to submit to the author for discussion. First question. The first question concerns the concepts of people and nation. We are on page 49. The author writes, I quote, "The people exist in itself, just as grass and trees grow. The nation, on the other hand, does not exist in nature." I think that we all agree on the second part of the statement. The nation is a construct, a construction. But I think that this is very interesting for our debate. I ask myself, does the people exist in nature? For example, in Italy, does the Italian people exist in itself? There is the population, understood as the inhabitants of a country, which certainly exists. But people, I think, is a slippery concept. And about this, I would like listen the opinion of the author. Is a slippery concept often used and abused today by populists, which is another name for nationalists. To stay with the example of Italy, for example, is the Italian people an immutable reality? Is the Italian people of 2024 the same as the Italian people 1861 or 1918 or of 1945? I am not sure, but I'd like to listen the opinion of Professor Hrytsak. Another question concerns the concept of ethnic territory. What do you mean by this? It is not a concept, I wonder, that contradicts the concept of a civic nation, which seems to me to underline the entire argument of the book. I think that I will stop there for now, and thank you for your attention. 10 minutes, 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Simona, for the meaningful comments, which I'm sure can be a very good start for a discussion. And now I would leave the floor to Simone, another Simone Bellezza, for his commentary, ideas, suggestions, thoughts about the book. Please.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, good evening, or I mean, depending on your location, maybe even good morning, good night, I don't know. Well, I would like to also thank Alberto Masoero and the Einaudi Foundation for organizing this meeting. As you probably know, I am the editor of the Italian translation of this book, and I am very happy to have this opportunity to discuss and present it to an audience of Italian historians who are, let's say, the ideal readers of this book, even if perhaps not the only ideal readers. Passing on to commenting on this book, I have to say that when I first read this piece of work, I was really struck by its freshness and originality. I will perhaps also repeat some of the comments made by Simona, but I do think that this is the main reason why I immediately agreed to collaborate on the Italian edition. I would like to acknowledge, of course, that the first and main proposer and supporter of the translation was Andrea Graziosi. We have to acknowledge that it was his idea. But still, I mean, the originality, let's say, of this book comes from the fact that, as Yaroslav Hrytsak says in the introduction, this is not a history of Ukraine in the sense of a chronicle of events, as Simona has already said. There are many history books, I think now, especially of Ukrainian history and published in Italy, that are just chronicles. And what I don't like of those books is that these are like lists of events which somehow try to hide behind a supposed objectivity of the reconstruction, the fact that these are also, even if they are in the form of chronicles, they are books made with choices, with omissions, with focuses on particular facts, particular figures, and the decision of, let's say, forgetting some others facts or figures or historical figures. So Yaroslav Hrytsak immediately says that he's not very interested in facts, in dates, in names, and what he wants to give is an interpretation of the processes of the social, cultural, political dynamics that let's say have characterized human history, let's say, in this region. This is something that perhaps we all say, for example, now when we teach. We all say that it is absolutely useless that students can remember the date and the name of a particular battle if they cannot remember the causes of the war, and or if the battle was particularly meaningful, and what are the developments of the war after that battle. So this book focuses exactly on this through an interpretation of events, and I would like to stress that this interpretation of events is honestly presented as an interpretation. Hrytsak says that he could be wrong, he could change his opinion through time because he's reading something new, he's discovered something new. And so what I'm trying to say is that through an interpretation of events, this book tries to give sense, to give a meaning to the events. And this is, in a way, real history. This is a way, what I would like to stress is that this is a good instrument for the students to read, to understand how history is done in general. To understand that history is not just like a very complex story and list of events, but these are problems, and we are trying to interpret the information that we have. And I think that the reason for this character that has been stressed by Simona and by myself now is that this book was originally written for a wide audience, not just, let's say, a handful of professional historians like us, but for ideally all Ukrainians. In the Ukrainian, let's say, book market, history books are very popular, and of course this book was very popular. And this is what makes this book also good for non-Ukrainian readers, I think. We must keep in mind that despite the efforts of a discrete number of Ukrainian historians, including Yaroslav Hrytsak, since 1991 and since the creation of a new national state, of course, Ukrainian history has been significantly politicized. History has been used by politicians and by what I would call perhaps public historians to justify the existence of a new state. History has been exploited in electoral campaigns. And since 2014, history has been even used by a foreign country, it is Putin's Russia, to justify a war of invasion. So therefore, drawing, let's say, a profile, a portrait of the national history of Ukraine is not easy, and it might even become risky, as historians have been, let's say, drawn to the battle in a literal sense. I mean, today, Ukrainian historians are unable to do their job because they are killed by bombs or they are enrolled in the army and required to fight. So this is something really risky. So the risk of writing a very teleological and nationalist version of Ukrainian history is real and was real. And what Yaroslav Hrytsak was, is that he was, let's say, very clever at avoiding the risk of a nationalist reconstruction. The first way he avoided this risk, of course, is this what already Simona said. I mean, the idea of a global history puts Ukrainian national history in a global perspective, and therefore greatly broadens the temporal and geographical horizons of the reconstruction. And of course, what we discovered, for example, using this perspective is sometimes very, very interesting and very something very new. For example, I discovered things that I didn't know, like, for example, the influence of the discovery of America on Ukrainian history, or perhaps that Ukraine had somehow contributed to the history of, let's say, pirates, and which you wouldn't expect from mainly land country like Ukraine. But still, I mean, I think that beyond all that, there is still a more, let's say, general interpretative problem on which I would like to also to ask Yaroslav Hrytsak to say what he thinks. What I mean is that if spanning the chronological and geographical boundaries of the observation, one also, let's say, poses the problem of the legitimacy of the geographically unmovable focus of the national history. What I mean, this is the question of the relationship between national and global history. How much are we justified to focus only on Ukraine when we are doing the global? And what is the relationship between the global and the national? Also because, once again, I will perhaps repeat what Simona already said in different words, but I think that especially, I mean, if one expands the chronological boundaries and look, for example, of the phenomenon of the nation, and we know that from after the French Revolution, as George Mosse said, I mean, exemplarily, but also others, I mean, nations are something completely different after the French Revolution. So this privileged perspective within the state boundaries that were set only in 1991, as a matter of fact, do constitute a problem when you are reconstructing. I mean, because, of course, the other book that I was thinking of is, for example, Timothy Snyder, that he wrote this very nice book about the history of a region, but he took the boundaries, the borders of the Lithuanian, Polish Commonwealth. And so this, what's the meaning of that? And because sometimes when I read the book, for example, there are some titles of paragraphs. There is one that really struck me. That was like how the Cossacks became Ukrainians. So my question, of course, I'm not an expert of medieval or early modern Ukrainian history, but are we risking to give nevertheless a nationalistic version of history when we are doing, or were really the Cossacks Ukrainians or not? Is it just something on this? The second comment, the second question that I would like to do is about something linked to this first one. So because we recall that Ukrainian history has been highly politicized in recent decades, even with laws that prohibited giving some interpretation of the Ukrainian national movement within the Second World War or of Soviet history in Ukraine, I believe that it is worth stressing that this book does not hide any of the darkest pages of Ukrainian national history, from anti-Semitism during the civil war after the revolutions of 1917, or the violence committed against the Polish population in Volhynia and Galicia by the OUN, the own partisans. So these topics are, however, treated more than once, and not so much and only in the chronological, let's say, story and the narrative of the book that, of course, you have in the various chapters, but also in what we have translated in Italian with the word intermezzo. In Ukrainian is mizhrozdil, let's say, interchapters, I don't know in English, which actually what these paragraphs do is taking a topic of cultural history or of material history, like the history of the Ukrainian folk songs, the history of wheat, and they introduce, in my opinion, the topic of a multi or transnational history within the reconstruction of a national history. Like the history of wheat is also like an excuse to addressing the question of the Jewish population of Ukraine and so on and so forth. So, and also, I would like also to test this. For example, at the beginning of the book, of course, there is these usual paragraphs about the origin of the name Ukraine, but also there is one paragraph which is, it was incredibly interesting for me, on the origins of the surnames, of the family names of Ukrainians, which is also very interesting. So what I would like to ask, going to a question is, these kind of histories who are not directly connected with the traditional political and national history can also contribute to increasing our understanding of national history and how much these other methodologies are developed in Ukraine and in Ukrainian historiography and can help us, understanding better Ukraine. And finally, I have let's say a third and last comment or question. So the only chapter that we as editors have asked Yaroslav Hrytsak to write again specifically for the foreign readers was the last one, the chapter on the history of independent Ukraine, because of course the Ukrainian version took for granted that Ukrainian readers know much more of the last few decades of history of Ukraine, while foreigners readers need some more information. So reading this chapter made me think a lot about the boundaries and status of contemporary history as a discipline and on the methodological definition of history in general. Also because, in the last 2 years, I've also written a couple of small books that deliberately reach up to 2022, 2023 in Ukrainian history. So sometimes I have been accused that this kind of history is actually non-history, that this is like political science. And of course, I think that, I don't know, a history of Ukraine that would deliberately ignore the last 10 years would be incomplete or perhaps even wrong. You cannot ignore what has been going in the last few years. But I also believe that, as usual, this is instead a question of methodology, of choices, of sources, of the uses of sources, and of historical perspective. What we are trying to do is like an interpretation that comes from an interpretation. They are trying to explain change using a longer perspective in time. So, when I read the chapter of this book, I was surprised because I found in it arguments and facts that are completely different from those that I put in my books. And this doesn't mean, of course, that any of the choices was wrong. Perhaps to the contrary, they are complementary. But that made me think that, and what I would like to ask is that perhaps the last chapter of this book has a specific task, a specific aim, which is of expressing the idea of overcoming the past, which is the real title of the book. The book in Ukrainian is actually entitled "The Podolati Minule," which is overcoming, let's say, winning over the past. So I would like you to ask a little more, because I think that what in our society has made remembering this duty of cultivating the memory of the past. This is one of the cornerstones of our society, or our ethics. And but interestingly enough, as Pierre Nora told us for the first time, this is a fake memory, because in reality we are required, we are asked to remember history. We are asked to remember events that we did not experience. So therefore, these events cannot really properly be remembered. We are remembered events that we haven't lived. And so I think that this idea of overcoming the past is really central and really important and needs to be explained a little more to be, let's say, evaluated by historians that are trying to imagine a civic role for themselves in today's society. So this was my last questions. I hope that I didn't take too much time, and then I will listen carefully to what Slava has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone, for your suggestions and your stimulating comments. I would ask Professor Hrytsak if he wants to reply and expand on these issues. Take all the time you want. We'd be happy to hear your comments on this.
Thank you so much for organizing this event. It's a great honor and pleasure to be on this panel, and I do really regret that I could not participate personally, so to say offline, for the reason that I explained, because basically there is a war and my son has been drafted to army. I don't want to leave my family and my country at such a critical moment, so I prefer to stay. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't attend this meeting. I also like to start with expressing my gratitude to Professor Alberto Masoero for organizing this event. Professor Andrea Graziosi, who is absent, who is my friend, who was kind of the stay behind the idea of translating this book in Italian. I owe him too much also in his explanation, and particularly to the comments of Professor Simona Merlo and Professor Simone Bellezza. I find them very interesting. I do agree with criticisms that say, basically, because we do realize as professional historians that writing a synthesis is a kind of academical suicide. Because basically you have to deal with the chapters, with the stories, with the periods that you could not pretend to be a specialist. So therefore, you're bound to make a mistake, misinterpretation, so to say. And therefore, I believe my book has many shortcomings, but they come from the starting point that basically professional historians they are aware of their shortcomings and they have to confess them, to admit them. Not to say to pretend that this objective work, all the kind of things. Yes, we're human beings and we're very much limited in our knowledge, and Ukrainians and historians, and particularly Ukrainian historians, are very limited per se. So this is something which I said at the very beginning. So you should treat this book, my book, with a kind of qualifications, caveats, and I would say that this is not a history, it's a history. One of many possible history. Let me just say why did I decide to write this book? This book was published 3 months before the war, and this book is very much result of the 2 revolutions in Ukraine, the first and the second Maidan. My understanding of these events is that this is kind of very much results of emerging new middle class in Ukraine. This is the class which now has their 30s, 40s, very educated, maybe Russian, Ukrainian speaking doesn't really matter, but very much to Europe, so to say, and also very much it works mostly in the service economy, not industrial economy like in the Soviet Union. And to a large extent, Zelensky could be seen as expression of this class, because basically there's people in their 40s, and now they're leading the country, and many of them fighting on the front. But basically, this is the class that emerged more or less in 2 last decades, and they need a kind of new history. I start with quoting Oscar Wilde that we have only one responsibility before the history, and it's rewrite it, because basically every generation has its own set of questions it has to answer, and that's exactly what I try to do. Basically, I want to make a sense of the presence, what's really going on, and the only way for me to explain the presence is to address the history. And in this sense, and I'll probably start from the end, I believe this is not a Ukrainian trend, it's a general global trend. Because nowadays we feel that history is more used, applied, so to say, because history gives probably better understanding. I would probably refer to the famous book, or rather booklet, which emerged 10 years ago, which is called Historical Manifesto, written and published by the then Dean of the Historical Department of the Harvard University, which basically says that we have to have some kind of applied history. history, they could serve as a kind of agency or explanation for the future, for our actions, to say, for responsibility. And let me just remind you that from the very beginning of the war, and before the war, at the Kennedy School at the Harvard University, there emerged a new institution. This is called Institution of Applied History, so to say. And it's the gathering of the leading historians who actually try to explain what's going in the present, the challenges, the threats, the global threats through history. And this is something very important. In this sense, these books address the same issue. Unlike the other histories, which was written about Ukraine, and they were very good, probably better than mine. But unlike their history, my main source inspiration didn't came from the field of history. My main inspiration came from the book Synthesis of Global History, written by the economist, by the Nobel Prize winner North Douglas. He writes some kind of synthesis of global history from economical perspective, which is called Violence and Social Order. And this is very much global history. So what I'm saying here, why is it important? Because why global? Why global? Because basically one of the main problems that Ukraine faces in the 30 years, why Ukraine fails in transformation. Ukraine is a very rich country in resources, in natural resources and human resources, but this is a rich country of poor people, so to say. And this kind of discrepancy, which also responsible for two revolutions, because more discrepancy, more people are willing to respond to this kind of discrepancy and the challenges. And basically, I believe the economic historians like to go north, they explain it very much and very persuasive, because basically they says they will get used to the idea that the normal state of the history of any society is prosperity, well-being, and peace. He says, no, it's quite the opposite. The normal state, the natural state to say, is violence and poverty. Because basically, for the last two centuries, some societies, not much of them, try to overcome these two persistent topics, which is poverty and violence, and they're related, because more violence you have a society, more society, the more poor it is. So this is basically was written in this case of sense, and I do understand that many historians wouldn't share this perspective, but for me it's very much inspiring. Now I come to the question and to comments and to criticism, which I share. I say, as I say, I do admit the shortcomings of the book. They are not avoidable, and I'm afraid that I'll keep rewriting this book the rest of my life, just to making this kind, introducing this kind of interfering this kind of the comments and criticism to make the book sounds more reliable. So basically the first point was written by the Professor Merlo, the population people, the ethnic group and people and nation. Basically in Ukrainian circumstances, the context, it sounds very similar, because this is the two main notions that are used by both professional historians and the white public, which is narod and nacija. It's roughly, Nazi is a nation, but narod could be roughly translated like a population, not specifically ethnic group, but population, like a people, because basically people and population, they share the same kind of the root, which is something which is inhabited in this sense. Without doubt, ethnic group is a construction. This I quite agree. But population per se, I believe something which belongs to this kind of nature state of violence and poverty. I may say it's kind of subtract. It's very much like people in social linguists use. I've been talking about this. They're talking about the evolution of the language. They say that at some beginning there was some subtract for many languages to evolve from this subtract. So there was like a Slavic subtract or a German subtract or Latin, whatever I mean here. What I'm saying here, that if you have this kind of subtract, it doesn't mean necessarily it could be just one nation. What I'm saying, the subtract gives a chance for emerging of several nations, so to say, but this is very important to see this kind of evolution from one state to another state. So let me put this way. If I could measure if they really exist, yes and no, because everything that as a human being is constructed. But there's something which I believe is very much a reliable criteria, and this would be used by many historians, especially demographers. So the people at the group which intermarry within each, which intermarry the people who are member of this group, they tend to intermarry between themselves and they exclude the others. So basically, population is very much exclusive category, in the sense that they don't know who they are, but they don't know who they're not. And therefore, xenophobia is very much criteria of this group. In Ukraine, it says there'll be anti-Jewish, anti-Polish, anti-Tatars, and things like that. So this is basically the state. And I would say the state of population of people around through the Ukrainian history roughly until 19th century, even to the 20th century. If you ask the average peasant about this nationality, he just could not answer, in response to this question, he could not understand what he is asking for. What's the concept of nation to say? Because basically, in most of the sciences, this was kind of little people, a kind of different patterns of behavior, all the kind of things. So this is basically how we use it, because it helps me to understand transformation of society into Ukraine. Because basically, I believe Ukraine is constructed, very much constructed. Because I'm trying to say how Ukraine was constructed, so I have to start with some kind of substructure to say. It's abstract, it's imaginary, whatever you say that, but I believe there is something in that. I accept this kind of very problematic concept, but this is a working concept. I believe it could work with this. And secondly, this concept could be treated roughly as an ethnic group, and therefore has ethnic territory. Also, it's very much the kind of the problematic concept. I don't aware of that. But the thing is, I don't use this kind of the contraposition toward the civic nation, because it's not a correct dichotomy. The correct dichotomy when it comes to the nation would be ethnic nation and civic nation, not ethnic group. Because basically the whole story of Ukraine, very much like in Polish case, or even Russian case, it's exactly the kind of the rivalry of two concepts, how to build a nation. Along the ethnic lines, like they have this kind of imaginary ethnic territory, or along the civic lines. So just to make a kind of the illustration here, you may remember or not, at the very beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, there was a video which became viral. This is video of President Zelensky and his team, who was staying in the president's courtyard and saying, we are here, we are not fleeing anywhere, we are ready to fight for our country. And there are groups of the 5 people. So not many people noticed the meaning of this photo. Out of the 5 people of this group, 2 of them were Jewish origin. It's Zelensky and Yermak. The third one was a Georgian, Arachamia. Only 2 were Ukrainians, Shmehal and Podolak. So this gives you the idea they're Ukrainians, they're Ukrainian elites, but they're of ethnic origin because they have concept of the civic nation. So my idea is this kind of the transformation from the ethnic nation to civic nation was very much resulting of the emergence of middle class, which reconceptualized the concept of what Ukrainian identity is because of the two Maidan, and especially because of the war. Basically, it's not Ukrainian phenomenon. You have it everywhere. There is a beautiful book written by Roger Brubaker, which tried to explain this as a 2 model. He calls this French model civic nation and German concept of ethnic nation. And basically, all over the Europe, as particularly in case of French-German rivalry, it's exactly about what a France, it's a civic or ethnic nation, what a German, ethnic or civic nation. And very much it's also extend to kind of the conflict between Poles and Ukrainians, Ukraine and Russia, and all the kind of things. But the most important point, and I tried to put it in the book, this is a wrong dichotomy. And this is what Brubaker says, because it's not about being civic or ethnic, because you could rarely find a pure ethnic nations in the world, probably exception Iceland and Japan, or probably Hungary, the some nation which are really kind of ethnically pure, so to say, or ethnically homogeneous. Because most of the so-called ethnic nations has national minorities, and sometimes they exceed the rates of the numbers of the 20 several persons, which is a lot. On the other hand, you could hardly have a civic nation which is not built around the ethnic core, like United States, which is more Anglo-Saxon core, like Great Britain, any other nation, so to say. So basically he says that the main real question is not civic or ethnic nation. The real question is, what will be ethnic core of civic nation? This is a real question. So my claim is this exactly the new ethnic core, the new core of this nation, exactly this new middle class. And I was writing this history particularly for this class to make them understand the processes, to get them better understanding what's going on with them in the present. So this is basically probably could serve as a kind of my excuse. When it comes to the comments that made by Professor Bellezza, again, I accept them. They make sense to me, but I was aware of them. I just try to, so in my book, I try to overcome them. So first of all, global history. Could you write the global history of nation? Without a doubt. The global history is a kind of new trend that emerged probably in the last 20, 30 years. And the basic presumption is they could write global history of anything or everything. It doesn't matter, just the way, it's not about subject, but how you define, how you write this kind of the history, the way you try to explore it. And global is not a world history, it's just to have connections, correlations with some events, so say that could correspond to this territory. And this is exactly why I'm saying why discovery of America was that important for making nations in this part of the world, how it's related. So what I'm saying here, yes, without a doubt, there's limitations, but you could always claim they could write the global history of nation with all necessary caveats and qualifications, so to say. And talking about when do we start? Basically, when it's discussing, and again, as I tried to best of my abilities, even so I failed, but I did it honestly. I was trying to decentralize nation as a main topic of any history. Even so I tried, sometimes I failed, but basically when talking about nations and the discussion about nations, origins nations, there are two big academic schools, academic camps. One is claiming that nations are very old, that they exist since the time immemorable, since the Bible or whatever. There is one of the most important books that just appeared recently was a book written by Azar Gat in Israel, which is a very good book, very good synthesis about ethnic origins of nation, which I found very persuasive. But basically, this is kind of say not the majority of historians share this kind of concept, because also it smacks of this kind of political legitimacy, because most of politics always say that their nations are very old. And the historians who say this kind of, they play into hands on this kind of political leaders. So this is one of the concepts which says that nations are very old. And there is a second concept to whom I belong, which basically says that nations are very modern. And they emerged more or less in 19th century. And I share this point, but with some caveat again, with some limitations. And I found these limitations in Benedict Anderson, one of the probably the most influential thinker or historians who wrote on the nations, the famous book on Imagine Community, which is probably classic nowadays, which is very much see this kind of the construction of nation, how nation be constructed is transferring from the traditional to modern society. So the point that Benedict Anderson says, he suggests a very nice compromise between this kind of primordialist who claims that nations are very old and the modernists who say that nations are very modern. He says basically there's a consensus that we could start story of the nations in the 16th, 17th century, which is very much European, so say, phenomenon. And this is problem how you described before that. What was there? And actually, I use the concept, not the ethnic group, but mostly traditional society, which I find very, very interesting. Anderson used this concept of sacred community because basically traditional society organized around the religion, around confession. And this very much explains that because basically transfer from the population to nation, from traditional society to modern society is transformation from the nation, which is sacred community, to very much secular society. And this is what I try to put into my history. That said, I would just claim that in the contrast to most of historians who write history, not only Ukrainians, but most history, I tried to emphasize how much violent this process was. That basically is not a violence, was not a byproduct or marginal, is essentially at the core of this process. That without violence, it could be hardly happen. And therefore explain that most of the many problems the Ukrainians still suffered because exactly long shadow of this extreme violence that Ukrainian society, or society in Ukraine is better to say, has experienced, especially in 20th centuries. I quote some historians who claims, and I share this belief, that basically both First World and the Second War, to a large extent, the result of war depended on what's going in Ukraine about Ukraine. Not because it's something to give pride of, because the importance of Ukraine of a source of the source of resources. Because since the war became global and total and world wars, resources are very important, and Ukraine was one of the regions most rich resources. So this I would finish at this moment. So again, overcoming mean here, not in the sense of this German concept Vergangen Gewaltigung, because the concept of overcoming the past, German concept, refers to historical memory, not to history per se. Exactly in the terms that Nora uses. Because basically our society depends on historical memory, and when they realize a history is not a history, is a memory. And memory per se, by definition, is very distorted version of history. As Ernst Renan, one of the most famous theoreticians of nationalism, put it very nicely, that getting a history wrong is a part of being nation. Every nation gets its past wrong, otherwise it would be nation, so to say. So I'm trying to step out of this. I don't need historical memory. I would say personally, I dislike historical memory very much. It's a kind of illness, so to say, because it's very much poisonous and contagious. So basically, what I use the term Vergangenes Gewaltigung, overcoming the past, but not referring to the historical memory, but history per se. The history per se means global history with the main two topics, which is poverty and violence. And in this sense, it puts Ukraine in the global context. Because I said this is the main topics or the main issues of global history since times immemorial. And therefore, it's more interesting to me how come civil society, especially those who belong to the European Union, how come they overcome this past? Because you could criticize the European Union for many things, and there's a very kind of legitimized criticism. But there's one thing for sure: you could hardly imagine a war between France and Germany nowadays, or between France and Great Britain, or between Germany and Poland, because European Union is zone of no war. This is something kind of new phenomenon, but they're saying how much it's rooted in the history and how much is precedented. So this is exactly my point, because since Ukraine are suffering from the war and the revolutions, political turbulence, my idea was to write history, how to help us to overcome this part of the past, not as a memory of the past, but the past per se, because I do believe this is the final point, that past shed a shadow over the presence. There's a kind of concept which I found like the handy past dependency that says basically where you come to, where you get to depends where you come from. And this concept is very much related to the Italian history. Let me just say that this is a good book written by the American political scientist making democracy work. It's about Italy, which tries to address the concept, the problem of mezzogiorno, and tries why history is that much different. Italy is much different, region is different. He tried to measure different kind of criteria, data, economical performance, level of education, all the kind of things. He couldn't find any correlation, and he came basically to the main conclusion: history matters. You couldn't explain this kind of differences if you don't take account the history. So basically, this main inspiration. It's very much in tune with a book on the North Douglas, which I referred at the very beginning, this kind of social violence and social order. And there's a certain group of the political scientists, social scientists, economists, not necessarily historians, who come to some kind of consensus. History matters. So therefore, if you want to create some kind of visions of the future, plan for the future, you have to take history very seriously, not as historical memory, not the kind of sanitized version of history, very nice, but the kind of history as it is, history of the global perspective with the two main issues, again, I'm saying poverty and violence. I'm sorry I'm getting too long, but this is only way to explain my real intention. Thank you again for my criticism, and I'm ready for the next round of questions and criticism.
Thank you, Yaroslav. Not long at all. And on the contrary, it's interesting and useful for us to understand better your argument. I will ask maybe Simona Merlo if she wants to reply or has any more suggestions, more comments to discuss, and then Simone Bellezza. Thank you. I believe your microphone is off.
Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you.
I want just to thank for the reply and to say that I agree about what Professor Hrytsak told us about ethnic nations and civic nations. And I think I want just to say that I think that it's very if you read the most important works about nations, I think that it's very difficult to find author that have just an ethnic view or others who have just a civic view. And I think that in reality, the two things in our society, in our societies too, the two kinds of nationalism are very mixed. There is the pure ethnic nationalism of the pure civic nationalism. And I think that this is I think that's so, and in history, but in reality too, in society too. And then I wanted, I agree about what Professor Hrytsak told us about memory and history. I think that's a very interesting this reflection about memory as a type of history. You said a version, I don't remember the word, but a version of history that always, I think, has some political or cultural interests. I think that memory, more than history, is object of political interests. And we saw this, I think, now not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe and in our country, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. Then I ask Simone, do you want to add anything?
Yes. So, so Yaroslav Hrytsak, thank you very much for your comments, for this very long, not very long, but long enough speech. Actually, I was taking notes when you were speaking because this is really interesting. I mean, the first things that really hits me in this speech is that there is, and perhaps I didn't know, but you have a very strong idea of an applied history as a sort of a discipline which could have a very concrete, let's say, or it's supposed to think of a very concrete way of creating something that is outside the norm. Because if we assume what you said that is true, that, and I would agree with it, that the norms in human history is violence and poverty, like for historians and history to assume to embrace this task of like finding a way to make the like building a piece of time and prosperity is, I mean, I don't know if you can imagine, it is an interesting way. I don't know if you were thinking of this when you were writing this book, or if I am still wrong in getting your let's say your aim, your task when you were, because if I correctly got what you thought, is overcoming history is not overcoming false memories, but is overcoming the concrete real history of Ukraine, of finding a way out of the difficulties of poverty and violence. This is, of course, a new, I don't know, I am personally very pessimistic on the opportunities of historians of influencing reality, both, as, I don't know, philosophers talking to the politicians, and both as like actors of history, as real politicians. So this is like, also, I would say this book then is also in a way a manifesto for a new kind of history, if one gets history in that way. And I mean, I would like to, specify that my comments were not meant to be criticism against the book. I mean, I'm an enthusiastic reader, but when I was talking about the question of memory, I was always thinking, perhaps this is like a mistake on my part, but I'm always in a way, perhaps in a Russia-centric perspective, thinking also of the other for Ukraine. And we have to know that, building a national conscience very often needs another against which we have to build. And in this case, you were also saying that looking at Russia looks like a nation who is like involved and is continuously rethinking of the past, while you use this image of the I don't want to be wrong, and now I'm confusing surely the original version with the Italian one, but of the car going backwards or forwards to the future. So this is a very difficult and completely different way of writing history, also from what you did at the beginning, or what you did in the 1990s or before, when it was more, let's say, scholarly focused. I do understand that. I agree with you that there is a new class, middle class perhaps, but surely there is a new leadership in Ukraine now that is trying to, that has taken control. There is a new elite. I don't know to what extent we can consider a new middle class, or perhaps this could be a question. How much do you think that this new middle class is big in Ukraine? Is it big enough to thinking of controlling and governing Ukraine in this action of overcoming the past or not? Also, considering that there is a war going on that is in a way contributing perhaps also to destroying this new middle class, of course. So and of course, seen like that, the idea of attacking Ukraine now seems very well thought on the Russian side. If you see emerging a new middle class who could be dangerous for your supremacy in a region, you are attacking, in advance, before it has, been successful in creating a new nation, a new state, a new real development, economic, cultural, social development of the national culture. So this is something really really interesting. And yes, I mean, the stress on violence is really interesting. This is something that we are also thinking, and the relationship between violence and economic, this is one of the most interesting things that you have said now. And I think that I haven't read, actually, I have to confess, I haven't read North Douglas, and I already bought it while you were speaking. So it's going to be my next reading in the next few days. But really, so thank you. These are not really questions or comments, but it was just reaction and say I was thinking while speaking with you. Sorry for being such disorganized.
Not at all, thank you. And I would add maybe a couple of angles, questions for Yaroslav, also from me, before listening to what he has to say, of course. And one general comment. Personally, I found important and interesting this stressing that peace and prosperity are not the norm, are the exception, sadly.
Yeah.
And I wonder if Ukraine has something to teach us about this, to Europeans who grew up in a relative prosperity and certainly peace since 1945. And it's a warning not to take this for granted. Yeah, I think it should influence our understanding of history in general. That was a general comment. Then I have two questions. One about a theme that Simona Merlo raised, meaning the rupture, the break of the Soviet stage in the continuity of Ukrainian history. And it's simply a curiosity. I would like you to explain better what you think. What do you think is the role of the Soviet period in this continuity of Ukrainian history? And the second question, again, it's more of a curiosity also for those who are listening to us, which is how your book was received among Ukrainian historians, as a way of perhaps give us a sense of the debate, of the controversies, which I'm sure are taking place among Ukrainian historians. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. Again, I say I accept the comments, and most specifically, I'll take very seriously any criticism, because it helps me a lot to rethink my book and my future edition. When it comes to the question which was raised by the Professor Bellezza, how numerous the middle class is in Ukraine, there are different criteria, estimations, so to say, and doesn't correspond necessarily to the well-being, to the material status, but basically, roughly, there's estimation that before the war, it was large, not huge, but large, and it's amassed or amount to 15-20% population, which is a lot, And basically say it's not that much related to the kind of the material status, but the way they behave, their values. And I would say one of the crucial factor is the scale of the university education and diploma in Ukraine. If you compare it to other European countries, Ukraine is one of the top. It's not because of the, so to say, a positive development, quite to the contrary, since Ukraine is that much poor or relatively poor. For many young people, universities was a kind of way to escape from the unemployment. In a sense, university in Ukraine was a babysitter, so to say. But basically, among the younger generation, it's approximately 80-90% of young Ukrainians who has a university degree, which is a lot. And the basic presumption is that even if the young people, if they attend to the worst possible university, still they have a very much different set of values in the correspondence with those their peers which didn't go to the university, they go immediately to the work. And this, as I say, is a kind of phenomenon. Why is that important? Because again, I believe it's not a just Ukrainian phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. Because basically you have a similar developments like Maidan, both in Russia and Belarus. You may remember well this kind of the Bolotnaya protest in 2012, which Putin ruthlessly oppressed. You have the similar revolution in Belarus in 2020, which is oppressed by Lukashenko. In many senses, could describe it in Kazakhstan and Armenia, practically in every country, starting from Occupy the Wall Street in the New York at the beginning of the last decade, then Arabic Spring, then the sets of the kind of the protest in the Singapore, in Chile, in Bulgaria, name any country, probably exception of Italy, but even in Turkey, in Iran. This is something which is quite a new phenomenon. And the last issue of New Yorker, by the end of the last decade, described this phenomenon that this was the decade of revolutions and best solution of this middle class. So the point is that in this sense, both Maidans belong to this kind of trend or the phenomenon, but the only real difference that most of this revolution has failed, it has been crushed. What you make Ukraine some kind of exceptional, that Ukraine is probably one of the few countries when this middle class has won. Like probably Tunisia and Armenia, I don't know any exceptions. So this is what makes Ukrainian case that particular, that interesting, why it happened. And one of the reasons why I say it's very important, because if you compare Ukraine and Russia, what you have there, that you have a Putin that rules country for 20-some years without any kind of change or rupture. Unlike in Russia, there has been already 6 presidents. In the sense that what Ukraine has and Russia does not, it's a mechanism of constant shift of power. If it's every new election, there's a new elite coming to power. And this provided with the ample space and possibilities for the young people of the age of 40s come to power. You could compare Russian and Ukrainian elites in many senses, but the main comparison will be that Russian is much more older, the generation older. Say Putin is 70-some, and most of his team are approximate of the same age. Zelensky is 40-some, and this is also approximately middle age of this middle class. So again and again, I'm saying here that a part of nation or as the other group, the one of the most important item or a group that I try to focus in my story is a generation change, which is extremely important because basically this shift or this flee from freedom and poverty has a very much strong generational aspect. With the emergence of new generation set our values who try to live a different way. And I would have my presentation in a week when I'm trying to describe when Putin takes decision to attack Ukraine. I believe very much it's exactly because Putin sees this emerging class as a threat to his power. Be it in Ukraine, on Russia, and Belarus, he believes more the same phenomena. So this is basically focused on my group because I try to explain how come this class has emerged and why he became victorious, and how come Ukrainians managed to have this mechanism of shift of power, which Belarusians and Russian and most of the post-Soviet republic, with probably exception Baltic and Caucasus, has failed to provide. So this is the topic. This is one of my main focus of this book, and I believe history matters because you have to have a history. Take history to explain the kind of differences. Again, I'm sorry that I'm going that in length. And this is coming to now comments on comments of Professor Alberto Mascarero. One other inspiration for me was Tony Judd. I believe, in my understanding, probably one of the best, if not the best, historian of the first few decades. Unfortunately, he passed away in relatively youngish age. But exactly, this is Tony Judd, who made this kind of emphasis that every historian should take violence very seriously. Oh, he reflects to Hannah Arendt, to Leszek Kolakowski, this kind of generation that survived the war and was aware of that fact. But basically says that basically we have to accept that what we have a kind of the nowadays European Union, it's very recent phenomenon, it's very fragile phenomenon. And one of the fragility of this phenomenon because the society tend to forget that violence is always there. There's virus of violence. It's historical very much. He could also kind of address the philosophical tradition starting from Albert Camus, which writes very much about that, so to say, about the violence. But basically says that the historians had to address violence. As every historian who ignores the crucial centrality of violence is not really a serious historian. And this exactly was my point. I was trying to follow this. In a sense about rupture of the Soviet Union, this is a very tricky question because most Ukrainians try to see Soviet Union experience in a very negative way. And I also share this opinion because most of the things the Soviet Union done was a kind of the negative experience. The Soviet Union was never kind of working society. It could not survive, sell decades. It was doomed in a sense. But what was important that it had some kind of the very important implications, the resistance of the state, and also would say there are kind of the, how should I say, Ukraine dimension, because we have to treat Soviet Union as a kind of anti-Ukrainian force, which is largely true. But if you focus on the 19th century intellectual thought, what was very important that most of Ukrainian thinkers didn't think about independent Ukraine. The idea of independent Ukraine was very marginal and came very late, before the revolution 1917. Most of them thought in terms of federation, large federation of Slavic people, Eastern Europe, in which in this federation Ukraine will have kind of the political and cultural autonomy, but not independence. In that sense, ironically, paradoxically, concept of Soviet Union was extension of this concept of the Soviet Federation of the East Slavic people. My point is, which also comes from the several historians, that Soviet Union was a kind of compromise. It was compromise was suggested by Lenin, because basically in 1917, 1920, after the end of the revolution, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, was not quite clear who won and who lost, because Bolsheviks has won in the ethnic core of Russia and the most industrial core. But apart of that, what they come upon is a huge backward agrarian peasant country, which is very much opposed to Bolshevism for a variety of reasons. And Lenin understood much better than anyone that you have to compromise, not kind of the attack. And there are two elements of the compromise. First of all, you have to come in with new economic politics, which can give some consensus to this kind of peasants. And second, he was aware that the only way to preserve the Bolsheviks in the center was to make certain concessions to national movements on the periphery, Georgian, Ukrainian, Armenian, and this is basically his concept. So what I'm saying here, that Soviet Union emerged as a kind of hybrid between two very unbelievable, surprising allies, which otherwise hated each other. And these allies were Bolsheviks on the one side and nationalists on the other side. So therefore, Soviet Union was a hybrid. It was both social and national. At one point, Soviet power tended to suppress national. It was against under Stalin, which come to extreme. But the other parts, especially under Khrushchev and Gorbachev, they tried to give concession to nationalism, so to say. So what I'm saying here, this is basically an idea that Ukraine emerged from this kind of hybrid concept of the Soviet Union. There has been belief shared by many Ukrainian politicians in diaspora that Ukraine would emerge as dependent state as a result of national revolution, some kind of mass violence. And they hope very much, counted on that, very much the 1917, 1920. But there's other school, it's called realists. We say, no, it never happened. We have to be realistic. What they say that Ukraine would emerge, independent would emerge out of the Soviet Union, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in many senses, there will be not revolution, an evolution. And this is exactly what I'm making this point, because Ukraine at the beginning, let me say, came out of the Soviet Union as a result of the collapse. And therefore, Soviet Ukraine, post-Soviet Ukraine was very much Soviet Ukraine, but also has a kind of Ukraine. So what I'm saying here, if I may say so, Ukraine is a marriage hybrid concept, and still is. And I will say all this hybridity nowadays is fading away because of the war. But in a certain way, this hybridity helps to keep Ukraine democracy. Because if nobody could have a power, central power or monopoly over this very much diverse territory, which is Ukraine, ethnically, religiously, give it as a names, or there are several regional elites which fighting each other, which basically means this country, these elites, at least the only way to keep the power is to make a compromise with each other. And compromise, we might say so, is the bread and wine of democracy. So my point is that Ukraine emerged because of this historical reason by default. It's a democracy by default, so to say, given dictated by historical circumstances. Nowadays, the main challenge of Ukraine is to transform this democracy of the default democracy into institutional democracy. Democracy could work, and I believe this is the main analysis which goes right to it. How we could overcome the past is actually creating this kind of institution that could stabilize this transformation. And I may conclude, this is my point, that in terms of transformation of Ukraine, overcoming the past, historical memory is not that much important. Much more important is radical political reforms, especially judicial reforms. Because basically, again, the idea is, yes, the global history is about violence and poverty, but there is, and it's norm, but there's new exception, which emerge in the Europe West and becomes a new norm in the 20th century. And the norm is limitation of central power, creating political system in which a ruler is not above the law, but below the law. And it requires political reforms. The main problem of Eastern Europe, particularly Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, there was a lot of economical modernization, sometimes quite successful, staggering. But it was economical modernization, not political modernization. And it's creating kind of gap or kind of conflict, so to say. And this made the country, the fate of the Soviet Union very unstable, because exactly it could not provide this kind of political reforms. Also put a huge question mark on China in this sense. How long could you have economical success, sustainable economic success, if you don't have a political reforms, to say? And this is my basic analysis, but this basic analysis comes from the global history, especially for Douglas North, because this is the main point. The only way to reduce the power is to make radical political reforms. Again, I'm sorry, I'm going to lengths, but again, just to see that I'm trying to move out of the decentralize the concept of nation, of national identity. They're important, they're interesting, but they don't really give a clue to understanding what's really going in Ukraine and challenges Ukraine faces. I'm sorry, I'm going too long. I'm very sorry.
And I do share with you, let's say, belief in the significance of institutional and political frameworks. I mean, we have been discussing about ethnic nation, civic nation, but then what is really important is how these collective identities in collective community actually work in practice through institutions, which can be very different, it seems to me. But no, of course, if Simone or Simona would like to add something or reply, no, then if not, I think I can thank you all very much for this conversation. Of course, to discuss in person is easier and perhaps there is better communication, but I still think we set out some interesting issues and problems. And so thank you very much for this discussion. And also thank you for the personnel of the Einaudi Foundation that has managed all the organization of this talk.
Thank you a lot. I heard a lot of compliments. I don't deserve them, without a doubt. It's a real exaggeration, but still they soothe my ego. So I'm thanking so much for this kind of thing that I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you
It was
next
a
week,
pleasure
I
to meet you.
think.
Bye.